For a long time, Christine stayed quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already said enough with her exit, her happiness, and her refusal to keep playing a role that drained her. But silence only works until disrespect crosses a line, and according to many viewers, that line was finally crossed when Kody and Robyn's behavior stopped being passive-aggressive and started feeling openly offensive. This is not a sudden outburst or a random reaction. This is a slow burn that has been building since the moment Christine chose herself and when David entered her life. That dynamic changed everything because for the first time, Christine was no longer standing alone. What you are about to hear is how years of tension, manipulation, and double standards led to a breaking point that viewers could feel coming long before it finally exploded. So stay with me, because every piece of this story connects, and once you see the full picture, Christine and David snapping makes perfect sense. When Christine left the marriage, she didn't just walk away from Kody. She walked away from a system that demanded sacrifice without reciprocity, loyalty without respect, and silence without protection. For years, viewers watched her raise concerns about emotional neglect, unequal treatment, and the way Robyn's household seemed prioritized while others were expected to accept less and smile through it. Christine was not subtle about her pain, but she was patient. And patience can be mistaken for weakness until it runs out. After her departure, Kody's narrative shifted dramatically, painting Christine as disloyal, selfish, and responsible for the family's fractures, and Robyn often echoed those sentiments, framing herself as confused and hurt while still benefiting from the very structure Christine rejected. This is where things began to feel especially offensive to viewers. Because even after Christine moved on, built a new life, and found visible happiness, Kody and Robyn continued to speak about her choices as if she owed them something. There was an underlying tone of entitlement, as if Christine leaving disrupted a system they felt entitled to control, and that tone did not go unnoticed. Fans saw it in Kody's anger, in Robyn's emotional framing, and in the way responsibility was consistently redirected away from the choices that led Christine to leave. In the first place, instead of reflection, there was deflection, and instead of accountability, there was blame. David's presence added a new layer to this dynamic, because unlike previous situations where Christine had to defend herself alone, she now had a partner who saw the pattern clearly and did not need to tiptoe around it. David entered the picture with no emotional debt to the family's structure, no obligation to protect a narrative, and no reason to tolerate disrespect. Viewers noticed that Christine's confidence grew alongside her relationship, and that confidence made the ongoing commentary from Kody and Robyn feel even more unnecessary and provocative. When someone leaves peacefully and is still targeted, it stops looking like hurt and starts looking like control. This is where many fans believe the snapping point began, because comments that might have been brushed off before started to feel intentional. The way Kody spoke about loyalty, obedience, and betrayal felt increasingly disconnected from the reality viewers watched for years. And Robyn's continued positioning of herself as the most affected party rang hollow to an audience that remembered who actually lost relationships, time, and emotional safety. If you've been watching this unfold and you've ever thought, why can't they just let her live? Comment below, because that question sits at the heart of this conflict. Christine's response up to this point had been restraint, focusing on her children, her happiness, and her future, but restraint does not mean acceptance. And eventually, repeated disrespect demands a response. This is especially true when narratives start crossing into territory that feels not just unfair, but damaging. Viewers began questioning whether Kody and Robyn's behavior went beyond emotional bitterness and into something more calculated, particularly when it came to finances, family assets, and public storytelling. The shift from personal grievance to broader implications is what raised the stakes. Because once behavior affects livelihoods, reputations, and children, silence becomes complicity. David's involvement is critical here because he represents a boundary that did not exist before. He is not emotionally tied to Kody's authority. He is not invested in preserving Robyn's image. And he is not conditioned to accept disrespect as normal. When someone like that witnesses repeated patterns of manipulation or narrative twisting, they do not interpret it as complicated family dynamics. They see it plainly. That clarity is often what finally breaks the cycle. and viewers sensed that Christine was no longer willing to absorb behavior that undermined her growth simply to keep the peace. If you're finding this breakdown resonating so far, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, because this story is not just about one argument or one moment. It's about years of imbalance finally meeting resistance. As audience discussions intensified online, more people began revisiting past episodes, noting patterns they once excused or overlooked. And that collective reevaluation added pressure to an already fragile situation. Christine and David's snapping was not impulsive, it was cumulative. The result of enduring behavior that crossed from hurtful into unacceptable. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something directly. Do you think Christine would have snapped if she were still alone? Or did having David by her side change everything? Share your thoughts in the comments, because this question speaks to how support systems empower people to finally set boundaries they once felt unable to enforce. As we move into the next part, the tension escalates further, reactions become more visible, and the consequences of Kody and Robyn's actions begin to surface in ways they may not have anticipated. So stay with me, because what happens next explains why this moment feels like a point of no return. As the situation continued to unfold, it became clear that this was no longer just about lingering bitterness or unresolved emotions. It was about boundaries being ignored repeatedly and narratives being pushed in ways that felt increasingly aggressive. Christine had already rebuilt her life in a very public way, and viewers watched her step into a version of herself that looked lighter, more confident, and genuinely happy. Something that stood in sharp contrast to the tension and anger still radiating from Kody. Whenever her name came up, instead of letting that be the end of the story, he continued to frame her departure as a personal attack, repeatedly questioning her loyalty, her motives, and even her character. And Robyn's reactions often reinforced that framing by positioning herself as the ultimate victim of choices Christine had made years earlier. This is where many fans felt the tone shift from emotional fallout to something more offensive, because the criticism did not stop even after Christine clearly moved on. It felt relentless and, more importantly, unnecessary. Viewers began to notice how often Kody and Robyn spoke about respect and accountability, while refusing to acknowledge the emotional neglect and imbalance that Christine had openly described for years. The refusal to accept any responsibility became harder to defend, especially when contrasted with Christine's visible peace and lack of engagement in the drama. When one side moves on and the other cannot let go, it stops looking like heartbreak and starts looking like resentment mixed with control. David, watching all of this from the outside, was not reacting from a place of history or emotional exhaustion. He was reacting from observation. That distinction matters, because when someone new enters a long-standing dynamic, they often see patterns that insiders normalize. From David's perspective, the continued public criticism of Christine, the framing of her happiness as betrayal, and the refusal to acknowledge past behavior likely read as deeply unfair. For someone who values stability and respect, watching a partner be repeatedly disrespected in public crosses a line quickly, and viewers could sense that his patience was wearing thin. This is where the snapping point begins to feel inevitable, because silence can be interpreted as acceptance, and Christine had reached a point where protecting her peace also meant protecting the truth. Fans noticed subtle but important changes in her tone: less avoidance, more clarity, and a willingness to stand firm when narratives were pushed that did not reflect her reality. That shift did not come from anger, it came from exhaustion, the kind that builds when someone realizes that no amount of grace will ever be enough. For people who refuse to reflect, audience reaction played a huge role in amplifying this moment. Because as viewers discussed Kody and Robyn's behavior, terms like offensive, manipulative, and even unethical started appearing more frequently, especially in conversations about finances, family resources, and the way power had been distributed for years. While the word criminal is loaded and complex, what fans were reacting to was the sense that certain behaviors went beyond emotional harm and into territory that could have real-world consequences. That perception alone was enough to change how the situation was viewed, because once people start questioning intent and ethics, the conversation escalates rapidly. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like someone was trying to rewrite history while you were standing right there remembering exactly how it happened, comment below. because that frustration is exactly what fueled this breaking point. Christine had lived the reality, and David had no reason to accept a version of events that painted her as the villain, while ignoring years of documented imbalance. That disconnect between lived experience and public narrative is what finally made staying quiet feel impossible. Kody's response during this phase only intensified the tension, because rather than softening or reflecting, he doubled down on control, emphasizing obedience, loyalty, and respect in ways that felt increasingly disconnected from mutual partnership. Viewers noticed how often responsibility was shifted away from his own decisions and toward the women who chose to leave. And that pattern became harder to justify with each passing episode. Robyn's emotional framing continued to lean heavily on confusion and hurt, but many fans felt it lacked acknowledgement of privilege and priority, which further widened the gap between how the situation was presented and how it was perceived. David stepping into a more visible protective role changed the power dynamic completely. He was not aggressive, he was not loud, but he was firm. And firmness can feel threatening to people who are used to control going unchallenged. Christine was no longer the isolated voice she once was. She was supported, validated, and grounded. And that made it harder for old tactics to work. Viewers recognized this shift immediately, and many expressed that this was the first time they felt Christine truly had the space to speak without being overshadowed. Take a second here to share this video if you're finding this breakdown compelling, because moments like this resonate far beyond one show. They reflect what happens when people finally stop accepting disrespect in the name of peace. The tension you're feeling now is intentional, because this is the moment where everything changes. In the final part, the long-term consequences of this snapping point come into focus, including how it reshapes public perception, family dynamics, and the future of everyone involved. So stay with me, because the fallout is where the real story reveals itself. By the time Christine and David finally stopped staying quiet, the damage had already been done. Not by their reaction, but by the years of behavior that led up to it, and that is the part many people miss when they try to frame this moment as sudden or dramatic. What viewers were really watching was the end of tolerance, the moment when patience ran out and boundaries replaced politeness. Christine was no longer operating from a place of trying to be understood by Kody and Robyn. She was operating from a place of protecting her reality, her children, and the life she had worked hard to rebuild. That shift matters, because once someone stops seeking approval from the people who hurt them, the power dynamic changes permanently. The public reaction to Christine and David's snapping was immediate and intense, because it validated what many viewers had been feeling for years but struggled to articulate. People were no longer just reacting emotionally. They were reassessing the entire history of the family through a new lens. Moments that once seemed like isolated conflicts now appeared connected, part of a larger pattern of control, favoritism, and narrative manipulation. When fans began revisiting old episodes, they noticed how often Christine's needs were minimized, how frequently her concerns were dismissed as emotional, and how consistently Robyn's household was positioned as the priority, even when resources were stretched thin. What pushed this situation into a more serious category for viewers was the growing belief that some of the behavior crossed from morally questionable into potentially harmful territory. While reality television thrives on conflict, there is a line where repeated misrepresentation, financial imbalance, and public character attacks stop being entertainment and start feeling unethical. Fans weren't just upset on Christine's behalf, they were questioning how long certain patterns had been enabled and why accountability always seemed to land on the same shoulders. That discomfort is what gave this moment its weight, because it forced the audience to confront the possibility that what they were watching was not just messy, but wrong. David's role in the aftermath cannot be understated, because he did not escalate the conflict, he clarified it, he brought calm where chaos had been normalized. And that contrast exposed just how unhealthy the previous dynamic had been. For Christine, having someone who did not benefit from the old system meant she no longer had to second-guess her own experiences. That kind of validation is powerful, and viewers could see it in her posture, her tone, and her refusal to be pulled back into arguments that no longer served her. This was not about revenge, it was about closure on her terms. Kody and Robyn's response to this shift only deepened the divide, because rather than acknowledging the impact of their words and actions, they continued to frame themselves as misunderstood and unfairly judged. That response landed poorly with an audience that had watched Christine quietly endure years of imbalance before choosing happiness. The more Kody leaned into rhetoric about loyalty and obedience, the more disconnected he appeared from the reality viewers recognized, and the more Robyn emphasized her own hurt. Without addressing her privilege, the harder it became for people to empathize. Perception matters, and in this case, perception shifted decisively. If you've stayed with me this far, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already, because stories like this are not about picking sides, they're about understanding patterns and recognizing when accountability finally enters the conversation. And I want to ask you one last question that really matters. Do you think Christine and David's snapping will finally force Kody and Robyn to reflect? Or will it push them deeper into denial? Leave your answer in the comments, because this conversation doesn't end when the episode does. It continues with the audience in the end. This moment will likely be remembered not for the snapping itself, but for what it represented. The end of silence, the end of one-sided narratives, and the end of tolerance for behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. Christine did not snap because she was angry. She snapped because she was done shrinking herself to make others comfortable. David did not step in to create drama, he stepped in to draw a line. That distinction is why this moment feels so powerful and why it resonated with so many viewers who have lived through similar dynamics in their own lives. As this story continues to unfold, one thing is certain: the audience is no longer watching passively. People are questioning, analyzing, and holding everyone involved to a higher standard. And that alone changes the future of this family's story. If you believe this snapping point marks a permanent shift in how Christine's journey is viewed, make sure you like and share this video, because visibility keeps these conversations honest. Sometimes the most important moments are not the loudest ones, but the ones where someone finally says enough and refuses to look back.